Welcome to the latest episode of our podcast series for financial advisors. Today's episode is the Advisor Transition Playbook, inside baseball on due diligence, the move, and everything in between. It's a special industry update with Mindy Diamond. I'm Jason Diamond, and this is the Diamond Podcast for financial advisors.
At Diamond Consultants, we help elite advisors identify the right environment for their businesses to thrive, whether that's at a wirehouse, boutique, or independent firm. With nearly 3 decades of experience, we've guided thousands of advisors and represented more than $250 billion in assets transitioned. And each year, 1 in 4 advisors managing $1 billion or more who change firms are our clients. Our process is education-driven and based on building relationships, starting as your strategic partner well before you're even thinking of a move. To schedule a confidential conversation, call us at 908-879-1002. Wondering why advisors change firms and where they're headed? Are transition deals going up or down? Those very questions and more inspired us to create our annual Advisor Transition Report. It's the award-winning, data-driven resource designed for advisors that connects the dots between the motivations around movement and the firm's appetite for top talent. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need to make smart decisions. Download your copy at diamond-consultants.com/transition report.
Everything about a transition can seem incredibly overwhelming. From understanding the whys of a move, then conducting due diligence, and on to aligning the right models and selecting the best firms, it might seem like a fairly linear process, and for some it can be. But for others, the layers of minutia can be daunting. Essentially, it comes down to the adage, you don't know what you don't know. So the goal of this episode is to share some inside baseball and how to get from here to there. I asked Mindy Diamond to join me to help draw from decades of experience in helping advisors through the transitions. We dive into the misconceptions, the common traps, the allure of a big check, and much more. Essentially, it's a download of what you need to know when considering a move. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get to it. Mindy, so excited to have you join me for this topic.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And I'm just thinking to myself, yikes, decades of experience, you said. And yes, it is decades of experience.
It most certainly is 30 years in the business. So the seeding for this topic was, you've been in this business now for 30 years. How many hundreds of thousands of conversations with advisors is that? Some who moved, plenty who certainly did not. But ultimately, what we thought would be useful, because it's a question we get most commonly from advisors that we speak with, is like, tell me what I don't know. What are the questions I should be asking? So I'm going to just pepper you with some of the most common questions we get. And I would love to share the benefit of your wisdom and experience with our audience. That sound good?
It sounds great. And I just want to say that we are recording this 2 days after one of the largest deals probably in the history of the industry broke, that I am gratified to say we facilitated. The Open Arc team, who left Merrill with $129 billion in assets under management, broke a couple days ago to go independent. And I'm hoping we have the opportunity to talk about some of their best practices and things we discovered along the way, because I think it's relevant. And a deal like this gets a lot of attention. People always want to know what they do right and what went wrong.
It's a good point. I'm glad you bring it up. First of all, it's so timely, but I think you can almost use it as like a case study a little bit to answer some of these questions. So let's dive in with that. I want to start with the big picture, why? Because that's the number one thing I think people want to know is, why do advisors move? And I think there's an assumption that 95% of transitions happen because of a big check or because of economics. I'm certain you're going to touch on that to some extent, but give me your sense of what are the main triggers of advisor movement?
Yeah. So look, are there some advisors that move because they need to recapitalize or they want the money? Sure. But the absolute vast majority are moving because they come to a place where one of two things is true, and oftentimes both. One, the pain of staying is great enough, meaning there's enough frustrations or limitations that they've gotten to a point where, despite efforts to the contrary to make it better, despite gutting it out and saying, on par, it's good enough, they come to a point where there's limitations in how they can serve their clients, how they can grow the business, and that's just untenable for them. And hopefully, simultaneously, they are equally excited and have identified an opportunity that they believe is needle moving enough. It's worth the hassle, the disruption, the everything to make this move. I've never done a move where it doesn't fall into one of those two or hopefully both of those categories.
So let's go a little deeper there. You mentioned limitations. Give me an example, either using this recent deal or even just any recent advisors you've worked with, about what are some limitations that people experience at, let's say, the wirehouses that potentially would be a catalyst for a move.
Generally speaking, the biggest limitations have to do with how they're able to grow their business and serve their clients. So, anything to do with excess bureaucracy, anything to do with an incongruence, if you will, between the advisors or the team's goals for how they want to serve clients or grow the business and what the firm is allowing them to do. So, using this enormous deal as an example, you've got a team that was doing extraordinarily well. Oh my God, they were the biggest team at Merrill. So, talk about having a bat phone to the top and the attention of senior leadership. And if anyone was going to be able to break through the red tape or get things done or eschew the limitations, it was them. And for a long time, they did. Their size, despite they were sort of increasingly unhappy, let's say over a decade. But despite their size, every year they became a little bit more frustrated. And after probably 6 or 7 years of saying, "We're just too big to move," they came to a point of saying, "We can't ignore this anymore. We've got a tiger by its tail. We have this extraordinary business that is growing exponentially. We've got clients that are complaining to us. And more importantly, we've got team members that are feeling stifled." And that's where it comes from, where there's problems you just can't ignore, even if you want to.
It almost feels like one of those things where advisors know they're limited. They can just feel it if you're fighting against the firm and instead of with it. I'll give you one other one that comes to mind as we're talking here that seems to come up a lot in advisor conversations, which is freedom of marketing. And that might seem like a fairly minor limitation, but I can't tell you how many times, certainly myself, I'm sure you too, you get call from an advisor who is heated. They're angry because they were trying to send some timely market commentary and the firm took 2 weeks to approve it. Does that fall under the same category of limitations in your mind?
Oh, without a doubt. And it's funny you say that because in this world of social media, where the news is consumed, can be consumed within seconds of an event happening, there's nothing more frustrating for an advisor than wanting to write a newsletter to update their clients with scale, as opposed to having to make one phone call at a time and not being able to do so. It absolutely puts them on a back foot. And then I think it's the lack of freedom to differentiate themselves. Most advisors that work for big firms have a firm website that is templated, the same sort of structure of the website and the picture of the team and the same basic wordings. And that's hard to deal with.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point, which is sometimes, so for example, advisors might say, wirehouse advisors might say, oh, the marketing is good enough. But a lot of times, and we've had advisors on this podcast who talk about exactly this, they don't realize how limiting limited the sandbox they were playing in is or was until after a transition. And that's when their eyes open and they realize, oh my God, I was basically playing with one arm tied behind my back. We've heard advisors use that metaphor. Let me ask you this then. This is a tough question. What do you think advisors get wrong? What is the number one misconception that advisors have prior to approaching due diligence and thinking about a move? And maybe it's something as simple as like, it's the same everywhere. But tell me what you think you hear most commonly.
There's certainly those myths, the assumptions or presumptions that it's the same everywhere or there's nothing that's going to change anyway, for sure. But I think the biggest and most fundamental thing they get wrong is a lack of clarity around what it is they're trying to accomplish and why. I'd like to say that I think one of the things, the thing we do better than most, I'm not going to say everyone else, but better than most, and something we're really good at, is helping advisors to answer the really tough questions, the smartest questions, to get a sense of what it is they're looking to accomplish, what it is they want to improve, and why. What does success look like? Because if you don't do that, then a lot of folks do it backwards. They get a phone call from a manager at Morgan Stanley or from somebody at Schwab or somebody at Dynasty or whatever it may be. And they say, I'll take a lunch. Why not? And of course, the job of the manager from Morgan or the sales rep from Dynasty or whatever it is to tell you all the good things about independence or about Morgan Stanley. But if I, as the advisor, am not really clear about what it is I'm looking to accomplish and why, it's going to all sound good. And I'm going to wind up more overwhelmed than when I started. And that is probably the number one thing that we see advisors getting wrong. It makes the due diligence process, if you choose to enter it, exceedingly inefficient.
And I totally agree. So I'm an advisor. I want to start due diligence in earnest. I know in my head things are suboptimal. I'm not going to go so far as to say I definitively want to move, but I'm a wirehouse advisor and I'm thinking for the first time in my career, I've built a nice business, but it's time for me to start getting educated. So what do I do? Do I just say, hey, John at Morgan Stanley, what's your recruiting deal look like these days? Like, tell me for an advisor who's never thought about this before, what does the basics, ABCs of this process look like?
Yeah. So it's definitely not first step calling Morgan Stanley, even if you're pretty sure Morgan Stanley is where you want to go. I'd suggest that's probably one of the last steps, and I'll tell you why. The first thing is to give yourself permission to say, even if I'm not 100% certain that a move is in my future, or that I know I'm unhappy enough to go through the hassle and disruption of making a move, to give yourself permission to get educated. The world, the industry landscape, the ecosystem, the everything looks entirely different than it did 5 and 10 years ago. And if it's been 5 or 10 years, or even 3 to 5 years, since you last got educated, asked the questions, looked under the hood to get a sense of, is there or could there be something that's better than where I am? You're doing yourself and your team a disservice. Yeah, it takes time and it's annoying and it's overwhelming and it's all of it. But that's honestly why people like us have a job. We don't approach this that we think people should only come to us when they're sure they're going to make a move. In fact, it's the opposite. We love the calls we get when somebody says, I'm really happy here. Been here 40 years. I've been here 30 years. It's really good enough. It's working well for me. But all of a sudden, I'm beginning to be curious, or all of a sudden, I feel X, Y, and Z. Tell me what I don't know. Those are the best calls. Those are the smartest calls. That's the best thing an advisor can do.
Yeah, I agree with that. Are there things you think an advisor needs to ask for during the diligence? Like, I guess what I'm getting at is, do you trust the process that if you go through this process with, let's say, 3 to 5 strategically picked firms, so you work with a recruiter or a shameless plug, or however you approach this, you end up with your short list of contenders. Do you trust that by going through the due diligence process, these firms are going to give you the building blocks that you need to do proper due diligence? Or are there things you as an advisor need to ask for? I'll give you one example that comes to mind, which is there's obviously been some firms that have had financial troubles recently. And so do you think an advisor, for example, needs to ask for like financial statements from a firm they're potentially considering due diligence on? Curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, particularly if you're looking at sort of in this new world order, the right end of, if we think about the landscape as a continuum and the newer boutique multifamily offices on the right side, absolutely conducting what we call reverse due diligence and getting to see the financials of the firms you're considering to make sure that they're sound and solid and that the equity valuation is exactly as advertised. Of course, yes, that's true. So the answer is, in part, you trust the process. You trust that if you've asked the right questions, if you've gotten clarity around what's important to you, and as a result, you've crafted the right questions, and therefore the manager or the representative from the firm or options you're considering has put together the right due diligence plan, you can trust that at least 90% of what needs to be gotten right is gotten right. But there are always things around the margins that aren't addressed. So one is you can't just outsource the due diligence process. You need to be paying attention. And much like, people who trust their doctor and presume the doctor just always has it right, you need to be your own advocate. I would say the same thing here, that as the process unfolds, there will be additional questions, additional sort of gaps and holes, and you shouldn't stop until you've gotten all of your questions answered. That's really the best advice I can give.
You're talking to John from XYZ firm and Jim from ABC firm, and they're going to tell you what's great about their firms. So how do you know that you're not just buying a false bill of goods? It's just a glossy kind of sales pitch. Part of it is, I'll give you my answer first. Part of it is I think you test drive the systems. I think another step I suggest a lot is calls with advisors on the platform. So an advisor who left UBS to go to Morgan Stanley, probably the best possible person to ask about Morgan Stanley. Any other additional thoughts on that one?
So you took the words right out of my mouth. Absolutely. That is the number one way to do it, is that you ask for an opportunity, and you can do it in a name blind way without sort of identifying yourself, to talk with advisors that have made the move, that are two things: that either came from the firm you're coming from, so you get a similar perspective, but it's equally important to talk to advisors that have similar business mix. It doesn't matter what firm they came from, even if it's not the same as yours. But how does someone that services international clients, how are they better able to serve those international clients at this new firm or new model than they were where you are? So we're talking about it as if it's wirehouse to wirehouse. But very often in today's world order, especially looking at this giant move from this week, it's about wirehouse to some version of independence. So there's so much more due diligence, so many more questions that are required. And it is even more important in that world to really get an understanding of what it's like from the perspective of somebody that's walking in those shoes. And I will tell you, Jason, and you know this, that literally the number one reason I started this podcast more than a decade ago, and why we continue to do the podcast and the feedback we get, is because the feedback from advisors that have joined a platform already is the very best feedback, the best sort of way of, in a discreet, confidential manner, to hear the truth from somebody who doesn't have a horse in the race, who's just sharing their perspective with you. And that's the feedback we continue to get. In a couple of weeks, I'm interviewing, as an example, Neil Rubenstein. Neil's an advisor in Texas that came from Merrill that we moved to Rockefeller. Perfect example. So many advisors that are considering a move, if they've got high net worth clients, are going to look at Rockefeller. Well, what better way to understand what Rockefeller is about than to hear it from an advisor that's walked in the shoes, not only of a Merrill advisor, but services high net worth clients, and that have information or perspectives similar to Neil. What do you think about that? Do you agree with that?
1,000%. First of all, the podcast, I will say, is a little bit of a sales pitch, has one thing going for it that a call with an advisor doesn't, which is complete discretion and confidentiality. I will say, I think we've done a good job of doing kind of facilitating name blind calls between advisors. We continue to harp on this point, even though it sounds somewhat minor, because it really is like, you can talk to people like me and people like the recruiters from the firms until you're blue in the face. But the right way, the best possible way to learn is this guy selling me? How does the technology compare to Merrill? How does the day-to-day compare? What's it like working for this manager? All those types of questions, I think, are best answered by another advisor. So
Yeah.
completely agree with you.
Yeah. And I'll take it one step further. So somewhere in the process, you take advantage of the opportunity to either listen to a podcast and hear somebody's perspective of what the move was like and how it's bettered their life and where the pitfalls are. And or you take the opportunity to talk with other advisors that have made the move so you can ask your own specific questions. But after you've had the opportunity to do that, then it's really important. And this is the part that why you can't entirely outsource or let the due diligence process just go on autopilot. Then it's important to take some of that perspective and hold the manager that you're interviewing with, hold his or her feet to the fire. What do I mean by that? So, I talked to an advisor that talked about the fact that the number one concern about Rockefeller, making this up, is that they're going to be the next Merrill, or that they just added a fee that now is going to have to be passed on to clients. While this advisor said it doesn't bother them and they had a lot of good reason of why it's not an issue, I'd love for you to tell me why it could be an issue. What are some of the things you've gotten wrong? When someone doesn't join Rockefeller, why is it? I'm making that up.
Yeah, smart. Same thing, even like, oh, this advisor mentioned that technology is a step back from the firm I'm coming from. And I'm not asking you to argue with me, but perhaps the manager might be able to say something like, we're investing substantially in the platform and we have these rollouts coming in the next several months that are going to close that gap. So I completely agree. That's a really
And the
smart.
follow-up question to that example, Jason, which is a great one, is how can I trust? How can I get a sense of security if I join here in the next couple of months that in fact that investment is going to be made and how that investment in technology will actually impact things? So again, it's constantly being your own advocate, constantly paying attention, and constantly questions beget more questions.
I agree. We haven't talked at all about the dollars and cents of this, and I think we need to because it's important, right? Like you can have the best platform on the planet. The reality is a move comes with risk, a move comes with hassle, and there is a market for advisors, books of businesses. That's one of, I think, the major kind of paradigm shifts we've seen in the last, call it decade, is advisors know their books are assets. Their book is a business, and that business is worth something substantial. At any firm, it's even at their current firm via retire and place deals, the book is worth something substantial. So if you had to put a percentage to it, what percentage, I'm an advisor making a decision, what if 100% weighting, how much percent weighting do I put on the economics and how much weighting do I put on culture, platform, everything else?
The answer is it's an inside job, personal, and it depends upon the advisor. There are some advisors that will put they're wrong, but they will put all the weight on personal economics. They're making
Right.
a big mistake if that's the case. And most advisors will put much more weight on getting it right, meaning what's life going to be like afterwards and will I have a better ability to serve clients and grow the business. But here's what I would say. They're both equally important. So, no advisor who's got a decent enough runway ahead of him or her and who's looking to really grow the business and who cares about their clients can't be unconcerned about the culture of where they're going and what life is going to be like and what are the limitations, all of the questions we've been talking about. But an advisor who's built a great business would be a fool not to consider their own personal economics. It just can't be the first thing they consider. And in the book I wrote, Should I Stay or Should I Go? I wrote that 100 times, that it's all about it. Lead with what's important to the business and important to clients, do the right thing. You can't ignore personal financial gain. So let's talk about this move of OpenOrg, this $129 billion Merrill team. You can only imagine the number of zeros at the end of a check that this team was offered by every major firm on the street. And in the span of a decade, they got those offers. Independence making this enormous leap was not the first thing they looked at, was not necessarily their first choice. But as they began, in their case, to really consider how limited they felt, the things they wanted to be able to do for clients. And by the way, I don't want to steal anybody's thunder because we're going to be launching a podcast specifically talking about this deal and this move. And so I'll save that for Louis Diamond, our partner, and Cheryl Penny, the CEO and founder of Dynasty, are going to be talking about it, and they'll cover all of that. But I just want to give the example that as this team began to realize, certainly in the last 5 years, how much things had changed at Merrill and how incongruent they felt between their goals, the goals for the business, the goals for serving clients, and what the firm was asking of them since Bank of America came to town, it became impossible to just say, holy cow, we can get a check with a lot of zeros at the end of it. They couldn't not see the benefits of everything else, the benefits that creating their own independent entity could bring them.
I agree with that. I will play devil's advocate a little bit here and say, I think what you're really talking about is the trade off. Not necessarily, they're not martyrs. They're not altruistic and said, we don't want your hundreds of millions of dollars. I think what you're talking about is the trade off between near term, upfront recruiting deals, which is the primary means by which the wirehouses, the regionals, the boutique firms recruit, right? The traditional forgivable loan structure is all about a short term de risking of the move, a monetization event in the near term. where they're paying you some percentage of revenue, 350%, 400% of revenue, tied to a forgivable loan. But that's your bite of the apple in that example. With the example of a move to independence, you lose, in some cases, all of that upfront monetization. So this example you're talking about is a good example where they got no upfront transition dollars because they launched an RIA. But, and this is a very important caveat, they know they are building equity and ownership in something that is going to, at the current rate, be worth a preposterous multiple if and when they decide to sell it. So I assume that has to be part of this conversation around independence. Is it's not that you don't care about monetizing the business, it's that you plan to monetize the business in a different and probably more significant way. Fair?
Beyond fair, 1,000%. That's absolutely correct. And again, not only making it about this example, but it's a good example. So again, the possibility of getting a check with a lot of zeros on it. And by the way, also tapping into an already established, well familiar, well run infrastructure. Think about how much easier the move would have been to jump from Merrill Lynch to Morgan Stanley would have been their, not probably, it was their first choice if they were going to go the traditional route. Think about how much easier the due diligence process, how much less heavy the lift would have been in terms of due diligence. But certainly from a short-term upfront perspective. And that's really the key, is that not everyone has the appetite to bet on the long term. And to me, that's the beauty of the industry landscape as it's evolved and the waterfall of possibilities today. If you're a great team, and there are so many great teams, you're growing, you've got a multi-generational bench of advisors, you've got a succession plan, you've got sticky clients, you don't have 5,000 clients, but you have, 100 or 200 relationships. You've got a great business that you've got options for it. And there's no right or wrong. It's what do I want to be when I grow up and how do I want to live my business life? And if you queried 10 of those great teams, 5 of them will wind up moving to the traditional space. That doesn't make it wrong. It's just that's what's right for them. But the other 5 will have entrepreneurial drive, will value the long term, and willing to forego the short term upside in order to bet on themselves for the long term. And holy cow. Again, we'll save that for the episode that Cheryl and Lewis do to talk about what those multiples could look like. But I don't think there's enough zeros on the calculator to begin to think about what that business, their OpenArc's business will be worth even as little as 5 years from now.
I agree with that. I think the one point I would probably make in defense of people who go the traditional firm route, actually 2 points. Number one, I don't think it's only about I am not willing to bet on myself and I don't want to delay the monetization event. I think for some people, it's like the idea of being independent and putting the toner in the copy machine and the little K cups and that's just not appealing, right? I like going into a branch and they have everything. My desk is all set up. So that's one caveat I'd make, that some people just prefer the traditional firm world. The other caveat I'd make is there are advisors who rightly or wrongly believe in the brand name of the firm mattering. And so there are some advisors who say, like, look, I am a good advisor, but my ability to land and grow business is tied very closely to XYZ firm brand, Morgan Stanley. I think a lot of times we find that's not always the case as much as advisors believe. But I'm just trying to think of a couple scenarios where there are advisors who genuinely prefer or need or want the stability, big brand resources of the biggest firms on the planet.
So I totally agree. And actually, thank you for bringing those 2 caveats up, because I'd say there's a third caveat. Someone can't go independent. They don't have a next gen. They don't have someone that could do the heavy lifting if they're not capable of doing it on their own to build an independent firm. They don't have entrepreneurial spirit. They're 3 years from retirement and they don't have the kind of time that it takes to really build the value of an independent practice. And we have great respect for those people. But again, the cool thing about the industry landscape is that as it's evolved, there's something for everyone. It doesn't necessarily mean that the only choice is stay put or go to UBS.
Agree. In fact, there's probably even versions of independence. For example, like you don't have a successor. Well, there are versions of independence that might work where there's a monetization event on the back end where somebody can buy and inherit your book. So that is probably the coolest or most interesting thing, the most exciting thing anyway, about the industry landscape in the last, like, really call it 5 years anyway, probably even a little sooner than that, is especially in the independent side of things, there are options that check just about every box. Like you, as the advisor, choose what elements, and this gets back to your begin with the end in mind. Choose what elements of the business you like and want to maintain control over. Choose what elements of the business you don't. And there is probably a solution out there that works to check those boxes.
And then that goes back to what we were saying. So even if you are 90% satisfied and 99% certain you would never make a move, if you haven't gotten educated in some capacity, whether it be listening to a podcast, reading articles, talking to a recruiter, talking to other firms, talking to friends and colleagues at other firms, or some combination of all of the above in the last 5 years, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. And again, not because in any way we're trying to sell you on making a move, but because we believe knowledge is power and it looks different than it did. So make sure that you're challenging your own assumptions and that you're really crystal clear that what you believe or what you believed 5 years ago is still true today.
This is a little bit of a gear shift, but I think that there's a tie in here. If you are an advisor now, point in their career, they're wise to at least get educated, pick their heads up, understand what's out there. But then there's the question of like, when is due diligence done? But I'm going to frame this through a different lens here, which is I'm an advisor. I've done due diligence. I've talked to maybe 3 to 5 strategic firms. Is there typically like an aha moment when an advisor says, oh my God, it's RBC and I need to go that way and I know I need to move? Or is it more process driven than that? Like, what are your thoughts? Because I think a lot of advisors struggle with that. And I often find myself telling advisors, like, trust the process here, and you'll know when you don't have to know right away in the first inning of due diligence which firm or which model you're leaning, or even if you're going to make a move. But curious what your thoughts are on this one.
Yeah, in fact, we hope you don't. We hope that you don't go into this process with preconceived notions. We hope that you don't make a decision after one meeting because we do think that there's value in the process. And people get to that aha moment at different times. You and I are working with a team right now that is 22 meetings in. And that's not to say every process takes 22 meetings. But the team is sort of taking it slowly. They started out looking at 5 or 6 firms. They've narrowed it down now to 3. The goal is to get to 2 or 1, then to get to a home office visit to the one that's their first choice. They're absolutely getting closer. But even, and I'm probably exaggerating at 22 meetings, but I'm making a point that even at this point in the game, which is probably a good, would you say 5 months into the due diligence process, I don't know that they've had an aha moment. They have an aha moment that they know they don't want another wirehouse. They don't want to be independent because the senior member of the team is exactly that person we just described, that he doesn't have the kind of time in the business in order to make independence worthwhile.
Or drive. They just don't want independence.
Right.
Yeah.
And the next generation doesn't really want it. So at this point of the game, the aha moment is think we want a regional firm or a boutique firm, but it's not an aha moment yet that it's going to be this firm. And that's, I think, a good point. A lot of times the aha moment is the model first and then the firm.
And sometimes deal can be like the type, like, okay, I know I love the regional firms, but one is offering a deal that's 100% better. And that's often when we actually will counsel advisors. It's okay to consider the deal. The deal is a factor, as you said earlier. So
if I can, that's
please.
actually a great point. That's the perfect example of where always consider the deal. Just don't make
Right.
it your primary or first consideration. So if you've done all the right due diligence and 2 firms or 2 opportunities stack up next to each other perfectly, they both will allow you to move the needle significantly enough. They both will allow you to do better for clients and grow faster and do everything else that's important to you. Then it's absolutely time to make deal the tiebreaker.
You threw out 5 months and talking about 22 meetings. Let's table that. An advisor calls you, Mindy, this morning and says, I'm not unhappy, but I'm getting that itch. Give me the average time it takes them from that first call this morning to the moment they resign from their firm, and then give me the quickest they could do it if they needed to.
Yeah. So let me start out by saying that those calls we get from advisors come in 2 different categories. One is, I'm getting the itch, the straw that broke the camel's back happened yesterday when X happened. But the other call is the one we mentioned earlier, which is, I'm 90% happy. I am growing exponentially. I get time to coach my kids' soccer game. I have great quality of life. I have a great team. I've been here 30 or 40 years and life is good. I'm watching more of my colleagues go, or I'm feeling more pain, fill in the blank for whatever that is. And even though I'm 90% happy and I'm 100% convinced I don't want to move, that moving is a hassle, I can't not see the handwriting on the wall and I at least need to get educated. So let's assume that we get one of those calls. The reason I'm calling out the difference between the two is because the time it takes to do the due diligence is usually different. If someone is already at the point where they know that they're unhappy and likely to move, the due diligence process usually runs quicker. The due diligence process for somebody that's mostly happy and just beginning to get curious, sort of the latter example, might take a little longer.
Put some time, give me some real parameters to it.
Well, I'd love to hear what you think. What's swirling in my head, I mean, it's all over the map, but I'm going to say typically 6 months.
6 months was the number I was about to throw out as well. And I think the quickest you want to do this is 3 months. Anything beyond that starts to be basically a fire drill. We've done deals quicker than that, obviously. An advisor's gonna or has been terminated. But I think 6 months in earnest is a good, healthy timeline, especially, by the way, because a lot of firms are busy. Like, we're hearing this from a lot of the firm side of things these days. Depending upon what firm you're moving to, you need to make sure that the firm can handle you. You want to get their A team upon your breakaway and your transition, no matter what firm that is.
You think, Jason, that it's 6 months from, gee, I'm a little curious. I want to start to look. I want to begin to do due diligence. What does that look like? To my butt is in a new seat.
No, because I think in the example where you're just like, I'm a little unhappy, those early innings conversations typically play out slowly because the guy who's 90% happy is in no rush to say, set me up with a bunch of firms and let's talk about. So in those instances, it could take a year and a half because I think what happens really there is then there's a catalyst event that takes them from your category 2 to category 1, right? They went from a little unhappy, just curious to the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's when then they shift into the kind of more, or they say the firm has good example, right? UBS upset a lot of advisors with the compensation plan. They recently walked back a lot of those changes. I'm certain there will be some advisors who say, this is a nod to attrition. I've seen from management what I need to see, and I'm going to stay put. Equally, probably plenty of advisors who say it's too little too late.
Let me say something, and again, not to make this episode at all about this team in Atlanta, but that was a 10-year conversation for us. Literally 10 years ago, maybe even 12 years ago, but let's say 10, one of the senior partners on the team had called to say, curious, like really happy, doing incredibly well. Zero chance we are moving in the next year or 2 or 5, but like, what don't we know? And every year we would then have a conversation about what the landscape looked like. But I'm going to say it was 6 years ago when the conversation shifted from really happy, convinced we're staying, to starting to think we might leave at some point, but another 6 years until this really happened. Now, it's a good example because they were going independent, the transition itself probably took a year and a half.
And the size and complexity of the team, by the way, probably amplifies that as well.
So there are outliers on either side, and that's the point I wanted to make. Correct.
Very fair. I'm glad you bring that up because there's no cookie cutter answer. It totally depends on the makeup of the business, where you're going, how you're going, when you're going. I think we have time for like 2 more questions, and I want to make sure we get to this because we've talked about this through the lens of the advisor and the advisor's team. We haven't talked much about the client experience. And that is clearly some portability in general is something that gives advisors anxiety, rightfully so. Right? I think if you could tell a lot of advisors with 100% certainty that their book would move, I think many more would be interested in moving. I think portability is often, or concerns about portability are a lot of times what keep advisors in seats. I guess what I'm getting at is because that initial client conversation is so important, is there anything you coach advisors to think about or to say to clients or potential clients as they consider a transition?
Well, so, I mean, you have to be mindful certainly of your own employment agreement and the legal considerations of pre-soliciting.
Important point. Yep.
No way are any of us advocating for pre-solicitation. But you do have to have a pretty good sense in your mind without asking the client specifically who is likely to come and who not. And the determination, the sort of hypothesis or the supposition of who will come and who will not has everything to do with where you're going and the value proposition. Will I be able to make a compelling enough point? Will I have compelling enough reasons where it's not about me, the advisor, it's about you, the clients, about how I will better be able to service them? And if I'm able to say to a client, if I make a move or I'm making this move and I'm now going to be able to do X, Y, and Z for you, I'm much more confident that they will be able to come. In the case of this open arc deal, the Atlanta team, they did a lot of retirement plan business. So they had to be really concerned about how they were going to position this move in the new brand, separating from the Merrill brand, how they were going to convince their Fortune 500 clients that this was the right move. So it always has to start with what's best for clients and how will I pitch it, if you will.
I love how you answered that because it's like two different answers to me. Part one is handicapping the portability, and that's pre transition during the due diligence process. Honestly, if you're an advisor, you could do that now, right? If I were to make a move, here's my client who I know with 100% certainty would follow me. Here's the maybes, here's the no. You come up with a weighted average portability metric. I totally agree with you on that. And then the second piece of it is you have to be constantly thinking, this option might sound the best to you, but remember, you're going to have to eventually, I agree, not pre-solicit, but post-transition, you're going to have to sell it to your clients. So you need to be thinking about every conversation you have with every firm through that lens. Do you agree with that? Like, meaning I'm going to move my business from UBS to Morgan Stanley. You get paid a big check, but can you
Yep.
articulate to clients what's in it for them?
1000%. And it gives us this, it's such a good point because we're going to give you some inside baseball here. The number one question that any advisor who is in traffic with any firm or any model needs to ask is put words in my mouth. If we were fast forwarding to the day I made a move and joined your firm or joined your model, help me to understand what would the pitch to my clients sound like. And then you need to sort of absorb that pitch from the perspective of your clients. Put yourself in the shoes of your oldest clients, of your youngest clients, of your most important clients, of your middle of the road clients, of your middle net worth clients, whatever, of the institutional clients, fill in the blank. Does that value proposition fit? That is one of the best ways to assess whether a firm or an opportunity is better enough or good enough for you.
It's such a good answer. And I love the inside baseball look there. Also, by the way, it has this side benefit of you're forcing the managers or the recruiters to articulate almost like a succinct value prop on their firm, right? Like, tell me hypothetically, what would I say to clients about why you're just picking on Morgan. Why is Morgan Stanley better than my current firm? And that answer ought to be compelling. So in closing, I want to wrap this up with a question around the difficulty of a move. You've been in this business now 30 years. I think it's almost exactly 30 years. Has it gotten easier logistically to transition? And do you see that trend continuing, let's say, because partially things like AI, DocuSign and the like what are your thoughts on the nuts and bolts of transitioning?
There's no question it's gotten easier. There's no question that from a legal perspective, the advent of broker protocol certainly makes it less scary or less risky to make a move. But there are plenty of moves that are made as a non-protocol move, and that's not always the case. And the ecosystem, I should say, has gotten better to support the advisor in transition. Legal counsel that all they do all day long is facilitate these moves. Third-party consultancies, people like us that have been at it 30 years and have seen it all, and all the mistakes have already been made. We know how to do it. But with that said, moving is a hassle. No matter how much better the support system has gotten, no matter how many times a manager or a firm has transitioned advisors, it is a hassle to move. It is disruptive. It is a lot. And again, this statement is not going to win me a place in the Headhunter Hall of Fame, but you should absolutely not consider a move unless you have the appetite for some risk, for some breakage, meaning some loss of clients, and you're willing to shrink to grow, and you've got an appetite for some hassle factor to work perhaps harder for a short period of time than you have in a while. If you don't have that, then no matter how unhappy you are, you really need to seriously consider whether moving is the best way to solve your problems.
Yeah, it's a really great way to tie a bow on this episode. It was a lot of fun. I'm excited. I think that would be 2037 based on your 12-year timeline. So the next $129 billion team will have to schedule that episode out for 10 or 12 years from now. But Mindy, thank you so much for sharing your years of wisdom and expertise with us. This was a fantastic episode. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, loved it too. Thank you. My pleasure. As a financial advisor, you hold yourself to the highest standards of integrity, honesty, and credibility. You are successful because you take your professional responsibilities seriously and are dedicated to your clients. But are you living your best business life? Are your goals aligned with your firm's, or could a better option exist? Should I Stay or Should I Go is a book written with you in mind. It's a self-guided journey that walks you through the key steps that we take with our advisor clients. This strategic thought process and roadmap to professional self-discovery is designed to help you ask the right questions and think critically and objectively, whether you're considering change or not. Learn how to get your copy at diamond-consultants.com/thebook.